A class action lawsuit pending in federal court questions the constitutionality of the Minnesota Sex Offender Treatment Program. Senator Kathy Sheran joins me now to talk a little bit about this issue and the legislation that she pursued last session and what could come out of it in 2014. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Happy to be here.
So, Senator, let me begin with Minnesota law allows for state judges to indefinitely commit serious sex offenders who complete their prison sentences to a treatment program in a locked state hospital. So far, only one sex offender has been released from this program. Therein lies the problem, the question of the constitutionality. Let's talk a little bit about your legislation last session and how you think that proposal would meet the recommendations of the task force and perhaps appease the federal judges as well.
All right, but can I start by saying that there are three components of recommendations that the legislature needs to address. And to put it simply, it relates to how people get civilly committed or get into the system after incarceration, for example, what happens in terms of their ability to move through the system, so that's the mid area, and then the process at the end of how a person moves from one level of restriction to a less level of restriction under the process of commitment. So those three components, how you get in, what happens when you're in, and then the process of getting out. So all three of those areas are challenged in terms of whether or not they meet constitutionality.
And your legislation last session, which did pass the Senate, but it stalled in the House, it would provide options in the civil commitment process. It also calls for more reviews of patients. How far does this go in addressing the issues that you just outlined?
The legislation last year began the process. It developed something that we called high and intensive restrictive alternatives to the current model of care, which is at Moose Lake or at St. Peter. Right now, when a judge is asked to civilly commit a person who has already spent time for their crime, they have to determine whether or not they meet the standards for civil commitment, and that means they have to be demonstrable to a court that they are a danger to the public or to themselves, which is the civil commitment criteria for everything. Then if they meet that criteria, then they are placed in only one system, which is starting at Moose Lake. The problem is that there are people that are sex offenders that might need a less restrictive, although intense supervision than that Moose Lake system. That it was recognized by the court, and they expected us to be able to begin the process immediately of pursuing and developing less restrictive alternatives. So a person can be in multiple places and still be under the civil commitment law.
I want to ask, the Department of Human Services Commissioner Lucinda Jessup has said that she, as commissioner, can make some changes, and some of them that she proposes include more assessments, options for judges as they commit people, and speedier processes for provisional discharge. Would you support her making these decisions without the support of the legislature?
If it's within the authority of the administration to make reasonable changes and still meet the goal of public safety, then of course I would support that. The things that the commissioner is talking about were the essential elements of my legislation. We asked for the commissioner to send out a request for proposal and begin the process of seeing what's out there already that we could use as less restrictive or highly supervised alternatives to Moose Lake. We asked for a change of the process to get civilly committed, to divide it into two parts, so that the determination of their legitimacy for civil commitment is first, and then second, that after a complete and thorough assessment, a good determination of where they should be placed in a continuum of care services. And then finally, an opportunity for people who are committed to have more frequent reviews and to be able to debate and make an argument for why they think they should be moving through the system.
And Senator, we should stress that your legislation did pass the Senate with some bipartisan support. However, there was some concern over this idea of less restriction and potential public safety concerns. Do you think that there are issues of public safety if indeed there are different homes in different places and people and sex offenders are placed in areas with less restriction?
Well, I think that what we have is a set of persons who have committed sexual crimes that are all being treated the same. And we have an extremely restrictive system for people who do not need that level of restriction. There's variations in this population, including persons who may have some limited cognitive ability, and they might be able to be managed very well in a less restrictive, less expensive system. So I believe the capacity, depending on a really solid assessment of what the risk level is of a person, that we can establish variations. But more importantly, what we want to provide is for those persons who are in those highly restrictive areas, that they have an opportunity, a real opportunity, to gradually move through the system and begin to re-enter the community.
The House may take up this issue next session. Representative Tina Liebling is carrying the bill. Now, knowing the issue is in federal court and there are concerns that the federal court could take over the state program, do you think that this has a better chance of passage in the House than perhaps it did a year ago?
Well, I think a critical thing that you've said is that the court is serious about this, the federal court, and they have the authority and the capacity to come in and take over our system, make required changes, and then ask the state to pay for them. So it's in our best interest for us to be engaged in the process of making these decisions. The Senate has passed its legislation. The House did not for a variety of reasons, and I'm hoping that they're able to work those through. But the bottom line is that if we don't do it ourselves, it will be done to us. Now, I know there are those in the legislature that like to bypass this question, so to not take responsibility for the decisions that have to be made, sort of lay it off onto the federal court. But in general, that means that we will lose control over the decision-making process, deciding what is in the best interests of the people of this state and how we want to use our resources to support that.
All right. Senator Kathy Sheran, thank you so much for coming in to talk about this issue. Very important one. We'll track it next session.
Great. Thank you.